Morning folks, Col here. Welcome to another day, another show. So we're going to finish off the box today. We're going to do the last of the bits and pieces of cleaning it up and make it a little bit nicer. During the week I gave it a final sand and put one coat of finish on it, and this is the result that we've got. It looks quite nice just with the one coat on there, but that's obviously not enough. During the week I had a conversation with a couple of people about finishing, and what I want to do is I just want to reiterate a couple of different things that I believe you should follow up with when you're finishing off your work, and think about as well. One of the things that came up in the conversation was where do we finish sanding before we put a finish on it? Now, I spent many years in the motor industry finishing cars, and that taught me a lesson about putting finishes on and preparing material for a finish. The important thing that I found was that if you don't prepare it properly, you're going to end up with rubbish at the end of it. Your job is just not going to look nice. And when people compare, and I often have this when I go to shows or take my work somewhere, people compare my finish with their finish, and what the difference is that I've got a nice, smooth, clean finish because I spend the time, and it is time, finishing the work properly before I actually put the finish on, right? If you don't do that, then you're going to find that the end result doesn't match your expectations. And comparing my work to their work, and the reason that they haven't got a nice finish on some of their work is because they haven't finished it properly. Now, I've had an old mantra, and I sort of spruik this every time I go to a show or any time I talk at a men's shed or a wood guild about finishing, is the outside should be as good as the inside. And people go to me, what? That's stupid. Well, not really when you think about it. If you spend the time on the inside of the box and make it really, really nice, it should match the outside anyway. So if you reverse that and go, the inside should be as good as the outside, so the bits you can't see should be as good as the bits you can see, you will always come up with a really, really, really good result. And so during the processing of the box and making of the box, what I've done is I've sanded everything to about 600 before I actually start working with it. That does two things. Number one, it preps the timber so that you don't have to do a lot of finishing afterwards. It's time consuming and tedious. And secondly, you're not removing all that much material. You've already removed as much material as you're going to from the sides of the panel, so your thicknesses are all going to be where you want them to be. Now, if you start sanding when you've got an extra thou on the edge, on the thickness of the timber, when you sand it, you're going to take that thou off, and that'll give you the exact measurements that you need for your boxes. So it has dual purposes of actually getting things prepped before you start. Some people like to say, oh, well, we don't need to sand it. We're going to run it through the thicknesser, and because my thicknesser runs really nicely, and most of them do, if you look after them, and you'll end up with quite a nice smooth surface before you actually start. And they say, well, that's probably the best I'm going to have before I start assembling the thing and then putting a finish on it. I like to make sure that the finish is already started before I get into building the box. So think about that when you're doing the finishing. So what I've done here, and I've sanded the whole thing, and I sanded it all down to 1000 grit. In some cases, along the edges and along the front bits in here, where I had to get around the 3D dovetails, I've gone to 1200 before I actually started, because I'm working on a little bit of end grain on each of those dovetails. So I've done that before I started. and then I put one coat of finish on. Now the finish that I'm using, and there's lots of different finishes, and this is where I say experiment. The finish that I'm using is this one here, is just the Livos countertop oil. Now that I don't get any kickbacks from Livos or anything like that, but I find this one here is quite a nice one for this style of box. There are a number of different finishes that I do use for different types of boxes. The other one that I use is organ oil, right? So it's another Danish oil that I use often, and it has a different effect. So this is where experimenting makes a difference. So with these ones here, it's a natural oil, and what it does, as you can see, if you look at this carefully, I'll just go to this other camera. So Pam, you want to bring that in? You can see that it's a little bit dull, right? It's brought the colour up in the timber, and that's the silver ash and the red Banksia. So it's brought those colours up, and just a sec, there's a little thing on the screen there called a mouse. What's going on there? Get it out of the way. But it looks a little bit dull. So what we're going to do is I'm going to refinish the top of it with my final finishing before I put a wax on it. So we're going to do that today. Now I'm going to use two different techniques. Now the techniques that I use, like I said, I was in the motor industry for many, many years, and before machinery came along, everything was done by hand. So that's where I learnt the craft of actually finishing. So I'm going to show you some of those techniques that I used in those days to get things nice and ready to go, and then I will convert to some machinery that we've got. So two different techniques. Now the first one, when I'm refinishing the last bit of the box, what I'm using is a wet and dry sandpaper. Now there's a whole lot of different brands. People will say, you know, use this one, it's better than that one, and all that sort of stuff. I just find that we want something that's relatively fine. We don't want a heavy sandpaper. So 2000 grit. If you want to go to further, if you want to make it even finer, that's okay. What I'm doing with it is I'm removing what grain has been raised by the addition of the wet coat the first time we put the coat on. Okay, so when you do get it wet, it pops all the grain up, and what you need to do is just get that smooth. And this is where your finishing starts to really pop and make look really nice. So this is a technique that I used up until I bought the machinery and the equipment that we're going to show you in a sec. So first thing, always make sure we've got some sort of protection on our fingers and things like that. It's even though it's a food-friendly finish, I still don't like to get it all over my fingers, particularly when I'm trying to work with something else. So now, another thing that I spoke to somebody this week about was finishing recycled timber. Now, recycled timber to me is no different to this stuff. If you can find some really nice timber, and in some of the products that you find around, like the pallets and so forth, you'll find that some of the timbers in them are actually quite nice if you run them through a thicknesser. You know, denail it, of course, run it through a thicknesser, run it through your sander, and you'll find you get some really good quality timber. If you're really careful about it, you can actually pick out the quarter sawn bits and pieces out of those recycled pieces of timber and use them to make a quality product. So your finishing is no different to that stuff than it is if you were using high-grade furniture timber. So try and sort of think about your finishing as, this is the thing that makes it look, the whole thing look really nice. Because sometimes you'll find you've got pencil marks on it, tool marks, and it looks a little bit dodgy. So, you know, make the effort. Now, I'll just show you what I do here, and I'm not going to try and get too much on here. So I fold my paper in half. So all I've done is I cut a piece of a sheet of the 2000. I cut that into six bits, and as you can see, all I'm doing now is just putting coat finish on. Okay, so I'm just keeping it wet. Now the reason I generally do this by hand when I first start is I want to get into all the little nooks and crannies and the corners and things. There's nothing worse than picking something up and finding you've got little corners that are a bit furry. So fold it over and use your fingers. Your fingers are soft, right? Now, they will bend, they will shape around things like little corners and edges. So if you fold the paper around with your finger, particularly into these sorts of corners, and just give it a light can. I'm only using the corner of the piece of paper there. You can see I haven't got a lot of it down. And all I'm doing is I'm just giving it a light sand and keep it wet. So I've put the finish on there. And I do this along here. And this is the precision stuff. So this is the stuff where take your time. You don't have to hurry it.
Enjoy it.
Yeah, as Pammy says, just enjoy the fact that you've got this lovely product that you've made, and you're going to end up having something that people are going to ooh-ah and goo-gar over. So, and something that people will actually treasure when you've got it all finished. Now, the top of mine is relatively plain. There's not a lot of fancy stuff in it, but if you've inlaid and done that sort of thing, you'll find that this stuff will enhance it. Now, the other rounded bit, you see, that's all I've done is just gone around that with the 2000, brush in some more finish, like so. Now, the other rounded bit is the edges. Okay, so along these edges here, they're all rounded as well. And it's difficult to get a machine or a piece of equipment that will fold itself around that sort of edge. Okay, so if you use this part of your fingers here where you fold your fingers around, you can fold that around with the paper. Just make sure you don't touch bits you don't want to do, and work on each edge or each flat surface as an individual piece. And just focus solely on that piece. The reason I do that is because I don't want to reshape it or anything. So I'm not trying to do that. What I'm trying to do is just fold around the edge. And again, keep it wet. Make sure that you've got some finish on there. Probably not a good idea to do this on a really, really hot day where your finish is going to dry up. But as you can see, what I've done there is I've used my two fingers and I've poked them one on either side of the rounded curve, and I'm just using the piece of paper in there and just working around the corner. There's something satisfying about making sure that the thing is just perfect. So I've just worked on that edge. Now, a flat surface, if you've got we're going to use the whole flat of my hand here. So, finish, and just the flat tops of my fingers, and you can see little circles. You can do if you want. You can make it along the grain like so. I tend to find little circles like this. If you've got a 2000 grit piece of paper, it's not going to make much difference. You're not going to create a lot of swirls or anything like that. So that's the technique that I would use by hand. And we're not sanding lots of material off. All we're basically doing is just polishing the top with the finish. And as you can see, it's still wet. Keep it wet. the finish will hang around long enough or stay wet long enough for you to... The other thing that's happening here is you're creating a bit of a slurry with the material. So that's white material, and what I'm doing is creating a slurry, and that's also filling up anything that, any imperfections that might be, you know, pop their head up. So we're just fixing that as well. So it's not just about making it smooth. There are lots of other things happening as well. And as you experiment, you'll find that little things that you've found wrong with your construction, you can fix when you get to this stage. But only little things. You won't be able to fix a major scratch. You probably have to go back to a different sandpaper or a thicker grade probably to get that finish. So therefore, that's what I've done there, right? Now, when I've got that done, it's then out with a piece of clean cloth and just give it a wipe. I haven't done the rest of it because I'm going to do that by machinery, but... And you can see, and I'm not quite sure if we can get into the light there, you can see the sheen that's just appeared now on the top of that, and you can actually compare the difference between that and this surface here by just looking at that. It really has enhanced what's there, and it's not like a piece of plastic. It's actually a really nicely finished surface. Now, you can do all of that sort of stuff by hand, and in using those techniques, you'll get yourself a really, really nice surface, and it gives you it just helps you understand how your finishes, and I'll go back to my big camera, how your finishes come up in the end. So it's a really nice way of getting things done, and then we'll let it settle, and a couple of days later I'll put a coat of wax or something like that on it. But the other thing is, the other technique that I was going to show you is with a piece of machinery. Now, Mercer or Abranet, a little Mercer tool, right? Now, you've seen this on the show before. Now, this one here, my little Syros, is only a small thing. And what I've got on here just is a pad. Let's get up close with that. This little pad you can see on here. All right, they're just Velcroed, and they come in lots of different grades. So this is what the pad looks like. It's got its abrasive surface on one side, and then it has in between, it has a little sponge bit, and then on the outside it's got, of course, the Velcro attachment. Now this one here is 500 grit. I've got 1000 grit as well, and sometimes I use those depending on what I'm trying to achieve. But generally I use 2000, which is what I have on this one here. So this one's 2000, so it's just a lot finer as well. And I'm not sure if you can get any finer, but you can always ask the question if you ring up Christian at Japanese Tools or Mitch, and they'll help you through it. So there's a link to Japanese Tools is where I buy these. On Best Abrasives, I think is the name of the company, or part of the company anyway. So Japanese Tools in Sydney are the carriers at this stage. So you can get all your gear. Now this is an older model, and this has to run through a transformer, which is that thing there. Now normally I have the dust extractor attached to the back of it, but what I don't want is I don't want the finish sucked into my vacuum cleaner, okay, or into my dust extractor. So I haven't attached it. All I've done is attach this to my transformer, and nice light sand. Now this little gadget here if you look here, you can see on the top of it, I've got a plus and a minus button. I don't know if you can see those. It's a fairly old one. So what I want to do is I want to go down. Okay, so that's probably a bit low. That's probably better. Okay, and then all I'm going to do is just hold that flat and wet sand it with this cute little piece of a gear. Now the beauty of it is, because it's spongy on the edges like that, where you go into the edges here, it's not going to damage or score anything because it will fold up on the edges. If you want to do edges, you can actually fold it around exactly the same way as you would with your fingers. You can see on the front of that, it's actually folded around the corner, and I can continue my around the corner bit. So there's some advantages for this little tool. Keep wetting it so that it's wet all the time. Let's get rid of some of this stuff off here. So a little bit more. I don't want to take too much off. But what I'm doing is I'm impregnating into the timber the finish. Okay, so it doesn't spray it around. I'm going too slow for that. Tuck it up into the corners. The beauty about this little Syros is that I can finish around my 3D dovetails. Now, some of you probably will have seen me do this many times in my other projects and stuff like that, but I still get questions about why I do things and how I do things, and I don't mind answering the questions. I don't mind showing you again. Not everybody has watched the first programs that we did earlier in the year, but as you can see, it's not moving very fast, but it is giving a nice workout. Okay, let's stop there with that. My piece of rag. Now make sure your piece of rag is nice and clean. Okay, so all I'm doing there is just wiping the excess off. Now normally what I would do is I'd let that sit for a little while. You can see it's still a little bit dull. I would let that sit for a little while and then I'll put a second coat on. But I think what I'll do is I'll put the coat on now, the second coat on it, and when you feel that, if I took the glove off and felt it, you'd feel it'd be exceptionally smooth. So just put the final coat on. What I want is I want this box to last 100 years. It will become an heirloom to somebody, whether it's one of my children or one of our children, or somebody who may want to purchase it. Okay, so nice and clean like that. Let it sit for a few minutes. So hopefully what what I've done is I've given you the impetus to actually build on your finishing. The other thing that I say, and I say this every single time that I do a finish, is that's the last thing you do to the job, but it's the first thing that anybody sees when they pick the box up. All right. So the first thing they look at it and go, "Wow, that's a nice finish." You will find that happens every single time you make something. If it's all scratched and it doesn't look, and it's dull, and you can see the tooling marks, you can see things on it that don't belong there. That's the first thing they say is, "Whoa, you left a scratch on it. Oh, you forgot to sand this, or you forgot to put a finish on that." And I'd rather them say, "Wow, that looks good," rather than, "Oh dear." So and I'm not going to wax it today because I want to let that sit for a little while. All I've done is just wipe the excess off. I haven't tried to sort of rub it in or anything. Just wipe the excess off, and you can see it's a whole lot shinier like that. Okay, so that's going to be the end of this box. I will have to do the rest of it, but I won't do that in a minute. So remember that Lazy Susan that Dave made a couple of months ago? They work. So what we have here is you can see the sheen has already appeared on that, started to appear on there, and the surface is beautifully flat. So when you turn that around, and you can see how the top sheen looks, and your eye is immediately drawn to the top because that's the beautiful piece of colour, and that's where the comparison between the silver ash and the red Banksia looks. But see, other features that we have, you can see the chamfer that we put in the back there, so that when we open the lid, you can see that it doesn't bind or anything. So that feature is there as well. Now, somebody asked me about the gaps and things like that, and last week when we put it together, there was a bit of a spring in the lid, and that was because that I hadn't screwed one of the screws down, and it was binding on the hinge. So it's just a matter of re-screwing the hinge down, the screw down in the hinge, and it worked fine. I've got a slight gap on here, so it's lifted a little bit at the back. The back of the box is here, there. You can see there's a little bit of a gap in there, and that's to allow for movement during humidity changes. And you can see at the front of the box, it's quite nice and flat. Okay, and so when you open the box and you look in the box, you can see there's got this beautiful clean finish around the inside where you've got the two different colours. If you don't want to see that, well, if you're the pieces that you have that you're going to put in there are a little bit more precious than sitting on a piece of timber, of course you'll put something in the bottom of it. You can also see that the butterflies show through on your corners, everything nice and neatly fitted. Hinges look good, they look nice and neat. The little keeper that we made on the lathe is nicely done. And of course the lock on the top there, you can see that matches up with that. So everything has actually come together really nicely. Probably need to give it a little bit of brasso on the locks and hinges every now and then, but apart from that, it's quite a nice. And the inside of the box is going to get the same treatment as I did on the outside, but again, that will all be done by hand. So quite a nice looking little box. Now, proportions. People have asked me about proportion all the time. I generally don't have a formula. My formula is generally an A4 piece of paper, and if I cut 2 millimeters off it, I cut 2 millimeters off the length of it. I cut 2 millimeters off the width of it as well. That gives me my proportions and so forth. But visually, what we're looking for is something that just looks nice and looks right. And this one here, by adding the plinth, has made that happen. Okay, otherwise it would just look like this chunky little thing that sits on the thing. But by adding the plinth, I've lifted it a little bit, I've given it a little bit more height, which matches up to its length and its width. So yeah, have a look at that. You will make mistakes over time, but it's always, if there's a mistake, it's always a really good reason for, you know, learning something, or re-looking at your proportion technique that you build. Okay, so that's it for the little box. We'll take that off the stand. Hopefully you got something out of that. If you're following along with the box and doing things with me, well then you will have come up with a really nice box. So last week what we did was, at the end of the show, well, the week before, I had a number of questions about techniques and how to use the jig and what to do with the jig. And so I thought, what I'll do is I'll put together a little collection of different things to do with the jig, how to use it, how to get the most out of the gear that you bought. Now, it just does not make boxes like that box there. Last week what we did was we built this little piece of kit and a test joint. Okay, so that was our test joint. Now, as I said last week, I've used the texture to show why I do things and how I do things, and my reference marks and so forth, so that you can see them on the screen. I've written down measurements and so forth on bits and pieces of material. Now, these measurements are generally not hard and fast, but if you remember rightly, I showed you in the manual the list of measurements that will give you a nice even layout of your joints across a piece of timber. So there's a set number of measurements, right? Now with the A10, the smallest measurement, about 20.5 millimeters, will give you a dovetail, and you can lay that out nice and evenly across a small piece of timber. So 20 millimeters is not very much, but you can get a nice layout of the joints evenly across it. So every 20.5 millimeters that you add to the width of a piece of timber will give you an even layout. Right? Now, you don't have to stick to that. You can up and down a couple of millimeters and so forth, but that's doing square pieces of timber. What the real question came to me about was tapered pieces of timber, and so we're going to sort of fiddle around with a little bit of that, and thick and thin pieces of material that you can add together. So let's get the jig. The A10 is the one I'm going to use, continue on with. Now, all of the jigs that we have here, they all work exactly the same way, and you can do all of these features on all of the jigs. So there's no special jig for a special task, apart from, of course, my little butterfly jig, which I've developed for butterflies, so I keep it for that. And yeah, but you can still make little boxes with that jig. Now, a question came up during the week that I had to answer straight away. Just excuse my back for a sec. You'll notice on the end of the jig here, you'll see I've got a little flat plate. Now, the jig doesn't come with that plate. It comes like that. Okay? The plate goes on like so. They are an extra. You need to purchase those if you are going to use these techniques. That is an extra. It is not part of the standard solo jig kit. This is how they work. the slots in the top of it are designed to take the back bar of the Bessie clamp. Okay, so it's designed to sit in like so. All right, it's an addition, so that will fit like that on the jig. What it does, it allows spacing underneath the jig here so that you don't hit your clamp with the router bit when you're cutting your joints. That's what that's basically designed to do. And it makes it easy to clamp your timber up because it's a ratchet clamp. Okay, so somebody asked me what they were for the other day, so I thought I'd better answer that before we go too much further. Okay, now, thick and thin. So what I have here is I've got just two pieces of material. Now, I've taken these out of my offcuts box, and as you can see, I've written on them what they are. They're both 68mm because they're both 68mm because they're components from a box that I made some time ago. A little bit of Queensland maple, a bit of silky oak. So they're bits and pieces like that. This one's 12mm thick. You can see it's quite thick. And this one here is only 6mm thick. So it's half the thickness. So successfully we can join the two together without too much drama at all. When you do your test joint, of course, you'll have two pieces like this to do it on. I've done the test joint so that I don't need to do that again. And this is how we work it. What you have to do is work out, come in a bit close, Pammy. What you need to do is work out where you want your dovetails. Now, do you want your dovetails in the fat bit or the skinny bit? It depends on what you're doing with your box. Okay, so that's a personal thing that you have to sort of deal with. I'm going to put the dovetails in the long bit. I'm going to put the pins in the thin bit. Okay, so the first thing I'll do is I'm going to set this up. Oh, no, before I do that, a face side mark. Now, very, very important, face side mark. That's telling me the bottom of the box. That's telling me the top of the box. Now, I need to do one on here as well. Bottom of the box. And yeah, you choose the grain and so forth and go through that process. We're not going to do that. So when I set up on my jig, you can do it two ways. If I had the piece of timber sitting there, I could do 3 full dovetails, right? And you hear me say this all the time. I like to have half a dovetail at top and bottom, which gives me a half a dovetail here, full one there, and a half one there. Once you've got that sorted out, what you have to figure out is your, use this as a point, spacing in here and the spacing in this side here, and make sure that they're even. Now, if they're not, it's not going to be a great drama, provided that you use this technique. Now, the technique that I use is I make sure that my face side mark is pointing at one of my stops. Now, the first cut of every board that I do will be pointed at that, right? So I'll bring my red stop up. Now I can bring the black one up. So my first cut will be here. Now, get myself some dovetail bits. Again, most important, bit of a scrub just to make sure they're clean. This only takes a few seconds, it's not that long. Bit of scrub with the collet reducer. A little bit of oil in my bearings. Just a drop. So everything works, everything's good. lock it in. Check my height. Now, you saw what I did there. I took that piece of timber to check my height. Well, that was incorrect, right? What we need, we'll clamp this on. Now, this is the opposing piece of material. It's going to go into there. Yeah. So the thickness of that, which is the 6mm bit, now as you can see, the technique that I've used is exactly the same as I used when I had two pieces of material the same thickness. Okay, so it should give me a perfect result. So let's go ahead and cut that. Just need earmuffs. Grab a pair of earmuffs. So ears on everybody, so thank you. So as you can see, nice, clean joint. Just come down onto that. Nice, clean little joint. Now all I need to do now is just turn that around. So I've turned my jig around, and I'm going to put my other piece of timber in. Now they're both the same width. And you'll see that my face side mark is pointing at my red stop again. Okay, that's how we started the first time. Clamp a piece of timber in place. Change the route a bit. If you're lucky enough to have two routers set up, this is pretty easy to, you can set it up before you start. So, and again, this is the thicker piece. This is the one we're going to use to set into there. So, like so. Now your maximum thickness for the A10 is 13mm is the maximum, because that's the length of the cutter on the router bit. So I generally come a little bit away from that, so I've got my joints protruding through each other. So this one here is 12mm. The minimum thickness that you have with the A10 is 5mm. So this has this is 6mm, so it's a little bit thicker. So let's cut this one. Now when we cut here, remember, cut across the face first, then take out the material, and do that in all of those spots. So there's my two pieces. A thick piece and a thin piece joined together with perfect dovetails. Okay, so you can see that the dovetail shape on here, right? The pin shape on the end. If you wanted to reverse that, you would get exactly the same result. Again, we're flat on the top because we lined it up properly, and we're flat on the bottom, which we lined up. So it's come up quite nicely. So thick and thin add together. So you can do that if you're making boxes where you're going to add a false front if you're going to add a false front on a drawer, you make your framework. Your sides of your drawer will be thick. So if you were doing a drawer, you would have thick sides, thin front, a thick back maybe or whatever. But when you add it there, you can actually get that thickness the same as this one here. So it will help you somewhere along the track, but that's the technique. And I haven't used any other different techniques apart from making sure that I used the two thicknesses to adjust the heights of the route a bit. Okay, so that's all I've done with that one. Now, that's using the jig where you have both stops pulled up to your timber. All right, it's an easy task to do, not hard. Oh, something that came up during the week. Somebody said to me, I couldn't get my dovetails to fit. What they did is they put dovetails on one end and pins on the other. Doesn't work that way. You have to have dovetails both ends or pins both ends. That's how it works. Now, where you have odd shaped bits of material, or you have this so close together you can't get your clamp around it. If I was doing, say for argument's sake, something that's only 20mm thick, I can still cut myself a dovetail in a thin piece of material like that. It's only 20mm thick. It's 10mm, actually it's 25mm. It's 10mm thick. I can still cut myself a dovetail in that just by sitting that on there like so, and line that up. Right. And I can use one end of the jig. Okay, so if I just put that on there, I can cut myself a dovetail. To cut the other end, just rotate it over, pop it back down again, and you can see the overlap of the clamp still allows you to do the right thing. But the important thing to remember when you do this is make sure you have the top and the bottom of your box marked. So these two pieces would be like that. And your first cut, the bottom of the box against the red stop. So that's very important. You do that every single time. That way, any anomaly that you have created here by not having that lined up will be negated because you've started in the right spot every single time. So very important to do that. I'm not going to cut that one there because I'm running out of time, and I want to show you how to use something that is not exactly the right shape. All right, now this is what I call my crown box. When you look at these pieces of timber here, you'll see that what I've done is I've shaped them a little bit. You can't quite see it. Oh, there you go. You can see it's shaped. I can't use both stops because that's in the way to get my thing, because I can't get an even layout of where things are going to be. If I brought the stop up, I would have it in a different place down the bottom here, right? So if I was going to make a little box where all the pieces are all different shape, I can make a box like that with lovely little dovetails in it. What I need to do is I need to use both ends of the jig exactly the same way that I used with that small piece of timber. So if I line this up here, nice and even. Now these are going to be very thin pins at the ends, but if I just line that up, and so I've brought my stop up and I've locked it in place, okay? If I do exactly the same on the other end of the jig, like so, and lock my black one in place, I'll end up with one piece here that I can cut, and then we just rotate it up to the other end. Exactly the same. So that's using the thing. Now the important thing here again is make sure we have our face side marks on here. Very important that we do that. Now, like I said, I'm only using a piece of texture. Normally I use a piece of chalk. I'm using the texture so you can see it. Okay. Now, when I'm doing this, the beauty about doing this is I can do both pieces of material at the same time. All right? I've got everything locked in place. If I cut my dovetails and then stop the machine and turn it on again and just went up to the other end, I'd be on and off the machine all the time. I'd be swapping and changing. But if you put one piece in and lock it in place, so, and get your second piece. Now all my pieces are the same size, so I've no problems here. We're going to run out of time, but I've got one other that I want to show you that came up. Somebody was asking me about one other technique. This one was quite important because people were asking about how the trays, this is going to overflow into next week's program. So you will find that as we go through the programs, a lot of these techniques that you've seen in past videos and these videos will pop up, and you'll see what happens. Okay, let's change the route a bit. So I always cut my dovetails first. Again, I stress, where's my spanner? Do your test joints with the material that you're using to make your box or your tray or whatever you're making. Okay. Height. All my pieces are the same thickness, so I can use a piece that's going to go into there. Here's my height. Lock that in place. Yeah, ears on, and I'm just going to cut these joints very quickly. Now the important thing to remember here is don't turn it over like that. You need the face side mark always pointing out. So when you rotate so your face side mark is out, which means it's got to go up to the other end to actually fit into place. The other one goes there. And your face side marks, if you get distracted somehow, then this is they will help you get through your next job. Okay. Turn my jig around. So one thing you saw me do there, so I tilted the jig up. I'm just checking to see that I'm hard down on the stop and hard up against my, hard down on top of the template and hard up against my stops. So now very quickly, I'm going to cut these other ones. We're running out of time, but we might have to go over it a tiny little bit today. Here's on. So as you can see, it doesn't take very long if you prep properly. So here we have one set. This is the bottom of the box, of course. And once you have your rig set up, you'll find that these tasks don't take long at all. The important thing to remember is test joints. Make sure you do your test joints. And as I said before, always use test joint material. You can see I haven't had to press that very hard at all. And there's my little crown box. And I've got perfect dovetails. It's flat on the bottom. There are no odd bits and pieces, but it's perfectly flat on the bottom. And as you can see, you've got little top bits. So I can do stuff like that. So
you've got some questions to answer before you finish.
Oh, okay. What have we got to answer? Abranet is excellent. Yes, really pleased with that. Hang on, I'll come to this other camera.
Do you use the same techniques with Danish oil when you were doing the wet sand?
Yes, I do. So Tricycle, I do. I use exactly the same technique with every finish that I use. So, and most of the finishes, I rarely use something that's got a dryer in it because that turns it into a poison. So it's always a good idea to use, I use natural oils that, they don't dry out too hard.
Next, Skip wants to know, would you quickly just repeat the names of the hardware manufacturers?
Hardware?
Like you in the locks and the hinges.
Oh, sorry, hardware. The locks I used on that one on the hinges are Crawford hinges from the UK. Andrew makes, I think they're called smart hinges and smart locks. So they're exceptionally good quality. And the other lock maker in the UK is in Ireland, in Hawthorne, and his are a comparable finish, and they both have different hinging techniques, so the knuckle is a little bit different in both their hinges, but you can make your own decision. But Skip, you're in the UK, you're in the US, and you'll find that you can buy similar sort of product from Brusso. So Brusso hinges have it, but they're not the same size. So, yeah.
Okay, and cleaning of the sanding pads when you've used it wet, when you've used them wet, do you have to clean them?
Generally what happens, who was asking that?
Tree cycle, I think.
Tree cycle, if you're asking about these little pads, they tend to fill up with finish. And the thing you have to remember is that it soaks through the pad, and the back of it gets quite wet. I've got a safety pad on there, which I put on my machine. Otherwise, the whole of that will get covered in finish, and then you lose the Velcro thing. But the pad gets thrown away. Yeah. Okay, so it's just too hard to finish it because it'll go hard eventually, and it's just pretty useless unless I'm doing if I do 10 or so boxes, then I'll use the one pad for the whole 10 boxes, and then I'll throw it away. And they're relatively cheap.
Skip wanted to ask about, do you use camellia oil? We know the answer to that, it's yes.
Yes, the camellia oil, we buy that from a local Japanese tool supplier. For those of you in Australia, this is the stuff that you can buy from Christian at Japanese Tools.
And the last question, and Wayne's gone, but he asked about what's the largest box you could attempt with the jig, like say a dory box.
You can make any size box you like. With this jig here, your maximum width here is 300, about 300. So if you've got two pieces of material at 250 each, well then you've got a 500 millimetre deep box. So you can make quite a large bit, but you make the whole box frame or two whole box frames, and then you biscuit join them together or you domino them together. So, and your length, it's dependent on how high your ceiling is. Yeah. So whatever length you've got.
But you could use jumbo.
Yeah, and then there's, as Pam was saying, there's jumbo, which cuts up to 480 mil. Okay, so I've got the bigger jig. I haven't got one up here on display. There's one in the cupboard there, but it cuts up to 480. So you can do quite a big box or quite a big piece of furniture. Most pieces of furniture are generally not over 400 deep. So, yeah. So that's good with the questions for today.
Yeah. So.
Okay. No probs. All right. Stay safe, everybody.
And
next week, we're going to introduce the project for inside. I've still got one more refresher to do, and I really want to get this one done. It was one that I meant to do on the end because it's going to be the segue to the trays, which I'm going to do next week or start next week. The trays will be.
Might do a midweek.
So. Well, that's a good idea there. I might do midweek one, so we'll have a little look at that too. But anyway, what we're going to do is the box is basically finished. What I want to do is something for the inside of it, which will lead to making trays for the outside of the box. Okay, so like for argument's sake, something you take around your kitchen and cup of tea. But anyway, we'll see how we go with that. So try and get back to us next week. Stay safe, everybody, and I will see you all next week.